My name is Professor Shana Gadarian, and I'm going to talk today in America at 250 about polarization and the American public. So in the course of this lecture, we're going to talk about basically three big questions and try to give some answers. I can't promise that we're going to resolve political polarization by the end of this lecture, but we are going to talk a little bit about what are our explanations for polarization and what are the consequences. I do want to start with the idea that American politics is polarized by party. I don't want you to take away that it always has to be that way, or that partisanship and parties are in and of themselves bad for politics. But extreme political polarization can have negative consequences for things like governance and cooperation, and we should be concerned about the effects on democratic health when our parties are so far apart and the public is so far apart that they don't want to work with the other side. Politics is absolutely about learning to make collective decisions and collective action. And if you think about the other side as an enemy or an opposition as opposed to a potential partner on some policy area, this can become a problem for democratic governance. All right, so let's start. So one thing I want to start with is there's a lot of hand-wringing about polarization among political leaders and among the public. In a recent study of local political leaders in the Civic Pulse study in fall of 2024, right before a presidential election, this was funded by the Carnegie Foundation, they asked these local political leaders whether or not political polarization is negatively affecting things like the country and their local community. And of these local political leaders, these are people who are mayors or on their city council, they're volunteers. More than 80% of them said either political polarization is negatively affecting the country. They were more sanguine about the effects on their local community. They still see lots of places where there is role for parties to have a benefit for their local communities. But at the national level, and I think you would see this in other polling among the mass public and other political leaders, there is a concern that political polarization at the national level has bad consequences for the country. And we can talk about some of what those bad consequences are. There's also a lot of, I would say, hand-wringing about polarization among the public. And don't worry, we're going to get to what it is we mean when we say polarization. But I do think there's a lot of discussion about polarization. And so we should start to think about, is this a bad thing and what are the effects? So in an October 2025 study by the Pew Research Center, which is a nonpartisan think tank, they asked voters, so these are everyday people, and they were interested in things like political violence, right? If you think about the assassination attempts on President Trump and other types of political violence that we have seen in the last 5-10 years, they were asking everyday people what they thought were some of the main reasons for that politically motivated violence. And in open-ended questions, the second most popular answer was political polarization. And I'm just giving you some examples of what some of the respondents in this study said. There's more than 1,000 respondents, but a Republican respondent in the 30s said things like, we have a larger divide between the left and right than ever before, so we don't see each other as people, but as the enemy. When you see someone as an enemy, you can justify a lot of awful things. An independent who was another respondent said things like, the country has over time become politically only two major parties with severely extreme and opposite views. So in these voters' minds, political polarization both is bad and is growing, and some of the consequences of that difference between the political parties might lead to things like violence. So we might think this is a bad thing, that political polarization, the fact that we have two parties and the parties are far apart, might be problematic for democracy in the United States. And yes, I think we can think about some of the ways it might be problematic. But being that this is a class on history, I do want us to keep in mind, this is not the most polarized this country has ever been, right? So I'm giving you an image here of the Civil War, right? So if we think about places where both the country and the political parties were further apart in terms of their ideas and how they saw the other side, I think we want to keep some history in mind to think this is, in some ways, extreme normal politics that we're experiencing right now. Political polarization may lead to governance and cooperation problems, like I saw, but it is not the same thing as leading to civil war and violence. And so I just want to keep in mind that we are concerned, and we should be concerned about political polarization, but we are not on the precipice of a civil war. And so I wanted to set that aside and also just keep in mind historically, the moment where we are often comparing this country to in the 1950s and 60s are perhaps an unusual time when there was more cooperation, but also more the political parties themselves were more ideologically diverse within and therefore closer together across the parties in ways that made polarization less extreme. But that came at a cost of having two parties that maybe were very similar to each other. And we now have more choices, but the parties are farther apart. And so we think about those trade-offs. But again, we need institutions and party leadership to translate polarization into normal politics rather than violence and conflict. But we are not talking about political polarization leading to civil war right now. So I just want us to keep in mind, yes, we're polarized. Yes, this might have negative consequences, but in a class on history, I want us to keep in mind, we're not talking about civil war. Okay, so I said, let's start at the beginning, which is a very good place to start, and just step back a second and talk about definitions of what we're talking about when we're talking about parties, partisanship, and polarization, because these are all important concepts that it's going to help us understand what is polarization, what are its consequences, and what are some particular things we might be worried about. I'm giving you an image here. This is a report from the 1950s from the American Political Science Association. That is what is famous or infamous in political science circles. It's one of the few reports the APSA put out over time about the party system in the United States. And the argument that this report made was that in the 1950s, then the parties in the United States had within them both liberal, moderate, and conservative wing. So ideologically, meaning their ideas about how big or small government should be, within each party were ideologically diverse. And what that meant was both that the public didn't have a lot of choices in terms of differences between the parties. They took a lot of the same positions. And then the governance of when one president was in charge was often actually made harder by the fact that there was a diversity within their party. So if you're a Republican president who has a Republican majority in Congress, but within that Republican majority, you have liberals and moderates and not just conservatives, that actually might make, if you are a conservative Republican president, might make policy making harder because you may have opposition within your own party. And so the argument that the authors of this report said is that we actually need parties that are more clearly different because it will both help policymakers and it will help the public. And I think this is a kind of an example of be careful what you wish for, because over time we have gotten clearer distinctions between the parties and more ideologically homogenous within the parties, but that has led to other consequences of polarization within Congress, within state legislatures, and in the public. Okay, so before we go on, just to be clear about what parties are and what they do. Parties are important in the United States, and to just back up a second, there's a lot of discussion in the early republic about the problems of faction and the problems of parties. And the kind of start of the republic is basically without a party system. But parties form very early on in the first Congresses. Now, they aren't the same parties that we have. But even though the founders don't want parties, they develop anyway. And that's because parties are extremely useful for policymakers and for the public. One, they connect interests and groups together to form coalitions. Again, politics is all about forming coalitions, and it is all about solving collective action problems, which is in a majoritarian system like we have, you need a coalition that's big enough to get your policies through. And a party as an umbrella allows you to create that coalition to help solve problems. Parties are very useful because they mobilize voters. They give people an identity and they make them seeable in the public to mobilize them to vote at election time. Parties coordinate office holders. They tell those office holders when there's a new policy, hey, this is what our party thinks, you should join us and vote for it. Now, politicians need to also represent their constituents. And so sometimes there's a kind of difference between what their constituents want and what the party wants. And those are places where you can get compromise and maybe you bring someone in from the other side. But essentially that coordination role is extremely important and makes policy making and coalition maintenance easier. It's also true that parties can constrain politicians to uphold democratic norms. I think some of this has broken down over time, but parties have some leverage because they have resources. They give you a party label, they give you money potentially at election time, they give you access to voters. And in exchange, as a policymaker, you don't go off and purport violence against the opposition or do things that are corrupt or harass your staff. And the party can use its leverage to say, we're going to expel you, which is pretty extreme, or we're not going to support you at election time. And we're seeing some of that happen in this Congress. So parties, again, are very useful. So I don't think we should think of parties as problematic for democracy. When we're talking about polarization, we're talking about those parties then being very extreme in terms of both their own policy views, their ideology, and very far apart. And again, far apart isn't necessarily problematic as long as there's room for that collective action and cooperation. So we talked about what parties are. We should also talk about partisanship. And I'm showing you here a classic political science volume called The American Voter, which is from the 1960s. And in this article and book that came after it, the authors, who are from University of Michigan, who are the founders of the American National Election Studies, talk about the importance of partisanship for how everyday people in the mass public both identify themselves, find other people who are like them, and connect to the political parties to know how to vote at election time. Partisanship is, in their definition, this is the one that I use in my own work, is a concept derived from small group identity theory, positing that one's sense of self can include a feeling of personal identity with a secondary group, such as a political party. So what does that mean? It means essentially partisanship is a psychological foundation that connects you to both the party apparatus and to other people who share your same partisan identity. What partisanship isn't in the United States is formal membership in a party. And why does this matter is because you can feel like a connection to the party and because you derive a benefit from being in the party, not a material benefit, not anything that you get, but you get a sense of self and belonging and connection to other people. When that partisanship comes under threat from an outside party, or you're told that your party is bad or evil, that makes you kind of more connected to your own party and maybe more in opposition to the other party. So the fact that partisanship is not just membership, it's not just benefits that you get, it's actually an identity for people, is important and very it's very powerful in how people both see themselves. Now, not everyone is a partisan, but for the most part, people identify with one of the parties or another, and then how you see yourself compared to the other party. The other thing that's important to note, and I don't need to walk you through this whole graph, is that increasingly in the United States, parties are coalitions of different social groups, and those social groups change over time, and they increasingly align with the parties. Just as I told you that the parties used to have ideologically diverse coalitions within them. So there used to be liberal Democrats, conservative Democrats, and moderate Democrats. And now mostly you see liberal and moderates. There used to be liberal Republicans, which no longer exist. So those ideologies have sorted across the parties, but so have social groups. So it used to be that we had more social groups that would divide themselves and identify with different parties. But now both people's social identities and their partisan identities are very much aligned because of how the parties have structured their coalitions. So what I'm showing you here is from the Pew Research Center. If you kind of go out over time, you go past 2016. This goes from 1980 to 2016. It's showing you the kind of percentage of college graduates, people by education level and by which party they align with. So one thing to note is that college educated voters have started to move into the Democratic coalition very strongly since 2016. That wasn't always the case. It used to be that it didn't really matter what your education level, it was whether you were a Democrat or Republican. Increasingly, Democrats have kind of created a coalition of college educated voters and higher. This is more so the case, particularly among non-white voters, but also among white voters. So race, education, gender, religion, these are all groups of identities that people hold that are kind of sorted into the parties and aligned. And so if we go back to this kind of partisanship definition, the identity with the party and the identity with your social group are now fused in ways that are very powerful. And so as you start to see yourself as a partisan and you get benefits, again, you're mobilized, you have an identity that comes from that partisanship, and it aligns with your other social identities, it becomes more important. And if you feel like it's under threat, then it has a kind of more powerful impact on how you see the other side. And again, whether you want to collaborate with them, whether you see them as aligned with your values. So just to kind of give you a sense of where does partisanship come from, we know that people's partisanship, that is this partisan identity, this kind of connection to a political party is not wholly assigned from your parents, but is correlated highly, at least when you're young, with what the partisanship of your parents was. One, because those social groups, again, are relatively aligned with parties, but also a sense of values of what you think of as important in life are also aligned with kind of parental socialization, group identity, as we talked about. If you are what religious group you identify with, or if you don't identify with a religion, your racial group, gender, these are all things that are assigned to you at birth and have social meaning, and then also have meaning to the parties and are places where the parties can mobilize you and say, you are this group and this group is often, in our coalition. Do you want to come join? We know that who the president is when you're young matters for whether or not you develop a partisanship that's aligned with that president. So I think there's a sense that young people are always Democrats. That's not true. People who grew up in the 1980s with a popular Republican president were more likely to identify with the Republican Party. It is true that young people now are more likely, for a variety of reasons, to identify with the Democratic Party particularly college age. But again, that's more about this generation of young people tends to be more racially diverse and college educated. And those are things that are more aligned with the Democratic Party in its current form than it was in the past. It's also the case that events that happen when you are young and coming of age politically are can shape the way you think about the parties. There's a lot of very interesting work about people's, I know this is ancient history to some of you, but whether or not you were likely to be drafted into Vietnam and the long-term implications for how you feel about the Democratic Party. So those are all things that matter for partisanship. But what I think is really important to note is that partisanship does what we call crystallizes when you're in your late teens, early 20s, and it has long-term implications. It's relatively steady over the life course. That is, it's not that it never changes, but once you identify with a party, you will probably identify with that party most of your life. Now, again, events, presidents, those things can change people's who they vote for, and they may move in and out of coalitions. But again, partisanship, because of when it forms in your life, is both very powerful as an identity and has long-term implications. So if you can see how this all wraps up into, because it's meaningful, if someone is in a different party than you, you can say, oh, they have different values, but it may take on a higher level of meaning. And you may think, oh, they're not someone I could work with, or they're not someone that I can think about as being like me. Okay, so we've talked about parties, we've talked about partisanship, and these are all related to polarization. We're going to talk about two different types of polarization and who is at those different levels. The first is we have what we call ideological polarization. That is ideas. Basically, ideological polarization is about often on the dimension of liberal to conservative, whether or not you think, how much the government should intervene in the economy and how much it should kind of intervene in people's lives. So we have been tracking as political scientists for a long time ideological polarization, particularly among policymakers and elites. Okay. So that is different. And that is a form of polarization. I think the one that people, again, that's kind of, if you go back to our Pew voters, what they're most concerned about is what we call affective polarization. That is not just do I disagree with you on like marginal tax rates, but I actually think you're a bad person. And I think you're different than me because of our partisanship. That's feelings, affective polarization. So we have these two different types. Ideological polarization, I'm going to show you some data. That's very clearly happening. And it's very clearly happening at the elite level. When I talk about elites, what we're talking about here are policymakers, office holders, those kinds of folks. For a long time, political scientists thought, well, yes, polarization is definitely happening at the elite level, but not necessarily at the mass level. What we have seen over the last 15 years or so is there has been increasing affective polarization as well. That is, again, your feelings about the other party have grown increasingly negative, especially among strong partisans. And that's happening at the mass level, everyday people. There is some ideological polarization, but for the most part, everyday people don't necessarily think as ideologues in the same way elites do. So we're going to talk about those types of polarization, where they come from, and then some of their consequences. Okay, you don't need to know all of these data, but this is visualization to show you the ideology of major parties going back essentially to the founding over time. So I'm just going to walk you briefly through what this graph shows us. First of all, this is ideology from Congress. And how do we know what the ideology of Congress is? Again, we're talking about conservative to liberal. That is, how big of a role do we want government to play in the economy and in social life? That's essentially what ideology means, right? There's lots of more nuance there, but that's the biggest thing. Okay. So one thing to note is that gray line in the middle. So these are ideology scores are taken from votes in Congress. So based on what Congress has in front of them and how the members vote, there's a group of political scientists who have derived a measure of how liberal or conservative Congress is as a whole, and also how liberal or conservative each of the parties is. So that gray line in the middle that kind of goes up and down from the founding, this stops in about 2016, but you would see this kind of same trend over time. That Congress, the median in terms of how liberal or conservative is, bounces up over time, up and down, up and down. But that's mostly because the majorities of the parties change over time. What's important to note is that red line starting in about 1860 or 1880, and that blue line are your Republicans and your Democrats. Again, some of this has changed over time. But one thing to note about that red line is it is more conservative than your blue line, right? Republicans are more conservative than Democrats. And the gap between them since about 1990 has increased over time. The Republican Party has grown increasingly conservative, and the Democratic Party has grown more liberal, but the difference is less stark. The Democratic Party was, for the most part, more liberal, except in the kind of 1960s, and that has a lot to do with its positions on race in that time. So essentially what we're seeing is there is increasing polarization in Congress in how they vote, and that is being driven by both sides, but more extremely by the Republican side, who has grown more conservative. Okay, polarization can happen in two ways, right? It can happen by the parties growing equally apart in terms of how ideologically they're moving far apart from each other, or it can have either party moving outward and increasing that gap. But either way, the gap is changing. And here, this is because both parties are moving, but just to be clear, the Republican Party is moving more to the conservative side than the Democratic Party is moving to the liberal side. Okay, so that we see polarization on ideology, how big or small government should be. And we see this, we can look at different Congresses over time to see that this really does matter in terms of the kinds of legislation that we get out of Congress. So it is also true, if you look at party polarization, the ideological gap between the Republican and Democratic caucuses, this is some data from again, that same vote view. These are called DW nominate scores for those of you who really are interested in Congress. And what we can see is while both there's increasing polarization over time, again, from 1879 to 2012, it is the House that is more polarized, right, than the Senate. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but the most important reason is that in the House, you can be more ideologically extreme and you are representing fewer people. People in the Senate need to represent an entire state. And so there's probably conservative and liberal people within that state. And so they have some obligations to representation that members of the House don't. But one thing to note is that if you look at this is how polarized these parties are over time, it's an increase in both the House and Senate, and then the House is more polarized than the Senate. So if you want to look at this in specific Congresses, one of the things is you can look at other dimensions other than economic. And often these other dimensions are social dimensions. These are votes that Congress is taking on things like abortion policy or civil rights and other areas. And in the 1960s, this is the kind of ideological divide between the two parties. The red dots are Republican members of Congress. The blue dots are Democratic members of Congress. This is 1965 to 1967. And these are social, I will just say this is the social dimension. There's not like the red dots and blue dots are clearly divided, right? Republicans vote together, Democrats vote together, but they're pretty close together. And you could imagine Democrats and Republicans working together on major legislation. You take those people in the middle, you kind of move them to one side or another on a piece of legislation. If you look at that same kind of plot on votes on the social dimension in 1985, now we're starting to see, again, the red dots are still pretty together. The blue dots are together. So the Democratic caucus is together. The Republican caucus is together. But they're starting to move further apart from each other. So it's just another way to show you the same data that I've already showed you. But I think this is the one that's pretty stark. And this is showing you both the economic dimension and the social dimension together to show you, and this is from 2024 to 2026. This is our current Congress. The Democrats are more to the left than they were in these plots here. The Republicans are much further to the right, and the dots are closer together. So what is this telling us? Again, it's telling us there are very few people in these coalitions who you would say are, so we have very few liberal Republicans, very few conservative Democrats, where we used to have those in the 1960s, often on the areas of civil rights, where they were Southern Democrats who were much more what we would say racially conservative on areas of civil rights. And those folks, and I'm going to show you one of the reasons we have more polarization these days, is that Southern realignment. And so just another way to think about this, and these are members of Congress, it's even the case if you look among people in the public, that the public is also growing more ideologically conservative. Okay, again, we're looking at polarization on ideology, on ideas, essentially how big or small government should be. If this is looking at a 2014 study from Pew, and this is looking at regular people, not members of Congress, and their ideas about different policy areas, and whether or not their views on those policy areas are liberal or conservative. Now, in 1994, we had about 3% of people who were consistently liberal in this study and 7% of people who were kind of consistently conservative. And those numbers have increased over time. And we had in 1994, according to this data, about half of the people, 49%, who had some sort of mixed views. Whereas that number by 2014 has decreased 10 percentage points to about 39% of people who now have more moderate or / mixed views. Whereas the folks who have more consistently liberal views now is 12%. That's a fourfold increase. And we have now 9% of people who have consistently conservative views. So what do we make of this? Polarization is real. We can see it in ideology in terms of the ideas that people have. We can see it at the kind of elite level in looking at votes in Congress, and we can see it at the mass level. Even though, to be clear, 12% and 9% of people with consistently ideological views is still a minority. Most people don't have consistently liberal or consistently conservative views. But the fact is that those numbers have increased over time. Importantly, though, I think what is more clear is that we have increasing affective polarization. And that is true in the mass public and in Congress. What do we mean by affective polarization? That is your views of the other party, how you feel about them, has become increasingly negative over time. So this is just a kind of what percentage of people, this is another Pew report, what percentage of people have an unfavorable or favorable view of the other party. And so if you look from 1994 to 2014 and you ask Democrats, what are your attitudes about the Republican Party? By 2014, and again, if we kind of went out over time, we would probably find this to be increasing. 79% of Democrats have unfavorable views of the Republican Party. That's not the same thing necessarily as having negative attitudes about Republican people, but their views of the party are pretty bad. And the same thing on the Republican side, right? Over time, from 1994 to 2014, when Pew asked these same questions, Republican attitudes about the Democratic Party, which were pretty negative in 1994, 68% of people said they were negative, to 82% by 2014. But we're talking about vast supermajorities of people who see the other party as unfavorable. So what are some of the consequences of that, right? So we talked about affective polarization. You have a bad view of the other party, but you may also have a bad view of other partisans who don't share your party identification. And so we have, again, evidence in the literature that we have something, not everyone, but we do have some evidence of things like voting or taking a position based on animus toward the other party, not necessarily liking your own party. We call that negative partisanship. Why do I want to support a policy, or why do I go out and vote? Well, because I really hate that other side. I really hate that other party. Some of that is normal in a two-party system. But it is also a problem for the parties themselves, because if all of what you're seeing is that people are taking positions or voting against the other party, it becomes hard to make them enthusiastic about what you're doing in your own party. And it creates a whole set of incentives on your mobilization and for the way you talk in campaigns to be very negative. But I do want to say, we see evidence of this negative partisanship, not just in political life, but you see it in social life as well. And so this is an example of when SU and Georgetown play each other, and it says, I've hated Georgetown since I was a little kid. That's negative partisanship. You've seen this in your own life. But again, because Georgetown and Syracuse don't need to necessarily work together in a basketball game, instead they're working against each other. Politics after campaigns is about working together. So you can imagine that this kind of this affect against the other party, this negative partisanship, may have consequences that are undesirable for the governance part. Okay, it's harder to put coalitions together. It's harder to work together. And it is true that Republicans and Democrats have very different ideas about what government should do to improve the lives of future generations. This is, again, a Pew study where Democrats have just different priorities than Republicans. And we're seeing that play out in this current administration, right? 65% of Republicans in this study said that they wanted to reduce the number of undocumented immigrants coming into the U.S. That the kind of policymaking around immigration that we're seeing is both about the priorities of the Republican Party and the priorities of the president. But the implementation of that has been done in a way that I think there's kind of negative responses from the Democratic Party, but also negative responses from within the party. Because I think polarization also gives a sense of policymakers that they can take what is a more extreme position without blowback or accountability within their party, which I think is mostly true. But the implementation of even these priorities that are different across may have consequences for your party if it's done in a way that is kind of unpopular. Okay, so we talked about polarization. We have affective polarization and ideological. It's happening both at the mass level, both at the elite level and the mass level. But why is that? Well, we have a number of explanations. I'm going to run you through them relatively quickly because I want to talk about an example of where polarization might have pretty dire consequences. So explanations include media changes. They're change the incentives for working together and for polarization. We have some congressional rule changes that allow for, again, less working across parties and more within parties. We have the breakdown of norms, much of which we've seen in the last 10 years or so. There are just a lot of things that we thought were expected of the way we act in Congress and with each other that turns out there won't be a lot of accountability if you break them. Teamsmanship, this idea that negative polarization and affective polarization, that your team is the only one who counts and you should endorse policies and things that will benefit them. And those kind of increases at the institutional level have made it so that polarization has grown over time. Importantly, on the mass public, part, there's been partisan sorting of voters. That is, the groups that used to be in coalition with each other have changed over time. And that is most clearly the case in the South. And I'm going to run you again through some of these in more detail. The South, which was the bastion of the Democratic Party for a long time, the Democratic Party used to exist as the one party in the South for a long time. It was part of the Democratic coalition, and over areas of social life, most importantly, civil rights, Southern members of the kind of Democratic coalition basically stopped running for re-election and were replaced by more conservative members who then ran as Republicans rather than as Democrats. Primaries are part of this also in places where we have primaries, and they are the most important part of an election, right? So if you think of an area that we can get to gerrymandering in the bottom, gerrymandering is not as big of an issue as I think people think. But in places where it's not particularly competitive across parties, where the legislature has drawn districts that are pretty clearly Republican or Democratic, when you have primaries, there is, and you're just capturing your own party's voters, there are incentives for more extreme partisans to try to stake out different positions and they are often very successful in primaries. And so you have more extreme positions in places that are increasingly less competitive. And so you get more extreme members in places where they are not going to be replaced by a member of the other party. They are going to be replaced by potentially a more extreme version of themselves in the next election if they lose. Economic inequality is another piece of the puzzle here of why we see increasing partisan polarization. So if you look at over time, the positions of the parties, this is a kind of graph of economic inequality and polarization. So you can see these things have increased over time at the same time. So there's increasingly a larger share of the kind of economic pie that is going to the higher income people. At the same time, when we have more extreme parties who are trying to do policymaking that will keep wealth at the top rather than redistribute down. And so one of the reasons you see increasing polarization is that redistribution of wealth is increasingly not interesting to people at the top of the income distribution, and polarization can keep some of that wealth with the top income groups. If we think about media system changes, we have a media system that went from kind of mainstream media where there weren't a lot of choices to a media system that has many both ideological choices and non-ideological choices that have no media content. And so one of the consequences of this is you have both increasing numbers of ideological outlets where if you want a conservative worldview and you want to watch Fox all the time, you have not just Fox, but a kind of conservative radio, Newsmax, lots of other ideological choices that you can both seek out and then reinforce your identity. And for people who like turned on the TV or scrolled social media, were kind of interested in politics, but not that much. They maybe were less partisan. They have lots of options now to opt out, right? They watch the Kardashians, or they could do, play something else on their phone. They do not get that kind of passive knowledge about politics that kept people both informed, but also less partisan because they were more informed about policy areas outside of what they were interested in when we had a more mainstream media that was dominant, as opposed to this very fragmented kind of media system, both that provides outlets for ideologues to talk about the issues that they care most about, get people angry about the other side, and gives people the option to opt out when they are uninterested. Importantly, the other piece of this is to look at on the mass public side is, again, this kind of realignment of people who lived in the South, who were relatively conservative on social issues and racial issues, and were Democrats for a long time because, again, there was a long time essentially after the Civil War, where there was basically one party dominance of the Democrats in the South, they then, once the party starts to see in the 1950s and 60s that it has the opportunity to maintain Black voters as part of their coalition, who are now demanding more rights after World War II and the Civil Rights Movement, the Democratic Party makes a strategic decision to support the demands of their Black voters, to maintain them in the coalition, and starts to take more progressive, racially liberal positions on civil rights. And the southern piece of the Democratic Party, which stands against many of those kind of civil rights laws for a long time, essentially kind of opts out of the Democratic Party, starts to take those conservative views and put them in the other party, and people run as Republicans, and they all kind of Southern Democrats get replaced by Republicans. So the ideology of those voters and those elites doesn't change, but their party allegiance does. And so we now have Southern Republicans who are more conservative than, and they're essentially, when you have Democrats who are in the South, they are more likely to be liberal than they were in the past, and often representing majority minority districts that have been drawn as part of civil rights law to keep representation for Black and other minority voters. So this realignment of the parties, again, leads to more ideological homogeneity within the parties on both economic and social issues, and it leads the parties to be further apart, where kind of those Democrats who were kind of conservative start to leave the party. They no longer identify as Democrats. They now identify as Republicans, and the Republican Party becomes more conservative. Democratic Party, again, becomes more liberal, because you don't have those folks who are overlapping in the middle there. So there's also a couple of things, right? Like, so those are just, again, some of the very few of the many, many explanations, right? There's nothing in political science and social life that it can be explained by one variable. Those are some of the things that have been offered to explain the rise of polarization. We also know who runs as a candidate has changed over time. So more ideologically liberal or conservative people now run, again, because of primaries. It's also the case that there's some interesting new work about personality structures of who runs, of who has sorted into the parties based on their worldviews, and that kind of those worldviews have changed over time. Okay, so I haven't given you one particular explanation, but I hope from this you have taken that there is increasing polarization. It does look like it's both ideological and affective. And then I'm going to shift right now to talk about one of the consequences of this increasing polarization based on partisanship and partisan identity, and what it means to be part of one party or another, and talk about some work that I have been doing on polarized responses to COVID, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, so we're going to shift gears now and talk about one of the potential consequences of political polarization. And so as we've been talking about, one of the consequences of polarization is that governance is harder. If both we have ideologically more extreme parties and there's less overlap between, it is harder to convince people to come on your side for votes, even on really important issues. And so you have seen in the last, Congress and number of Congresses, you mostly see party line votes on even very major legislation like the Affordable Care Act. It's very hard to get people to cross over to the other side when it is a priority of the presidential administration. And that polarization means that it's often harder to get important pieces of legislation done. Institutional trust is lower. If you think very badly of the other party, when they are in charge of government, you are less likely to trust what they are doing and then what government is doing. And so polarization has this way of lowering trust in our institutions that may not be about what the institutions themselves are doing. At the mass level, cooperation is harder when you think of the other group as very different than yourself, when you think of them potentially as harmful, as not sharing your values. So that cooperation, even with lower level projects that people need to do, might become harder. Now, if we go back to the beginning and talk about our local leaders see polarization as not as bad on the local level, maybe that's good. It's not quite as bad as at the national level. Partisanship on its own is not a problem, but it can erode democratic health if governance becomes harder, if it erodes institutional trust. And I'm going to talk one way about how polarization, not partisanship itself, can erode public health. And this is some work that I've been doing in the last couple of years about responses to the COVID-19 pandemic based on people and polarization. So I'm going to run you through this relatively quickly, and then we will kind of wrap up. So one of the things that we have noticed since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, that it has been declared over, but from the beginning of the pandemic until about 2021, if you look at, this is a graph from the New York Times looking at deaths per 100 people by county that people live in. And just to show you over time, early on, the deaths were higher in Democratic counties. These were counties that were run by, this is looking at Trump's vote share. So these are places where Trump didn't do very well in 2020 or 2016. And so in Democratic counties, early on in the pandemic, there were much higher death rates in Democratic counties. But around the time when you get the first COVID vaccines, this switches. And Republican counties, these are kind of more rural counties, places with kind of less healthcare systems that are robust, but also places where there's much more resistance to the vaccine, death rates increase pretty substantially, whereas death rates are still high in 2021 in Democratic counties, but the kind of polarization across those counties increases pretty substantially. So the question is, like, COVID deaths themselves are partisan, and how did we get there? And so if you just want to look at a different way, this is excess deaths in Republican versus Democratic states rather than counties. It shows basically the same thing. This is from a public health study in Health Affairs. Excess deaths are the number of deaths you would expect over and above what is normal in that place. People die of disease and chronic disease all the time, and accidents and other things. But we're calculating what's the effect of basically COVID over and above that. And you see early on in California and New York, there's excess deaths in these Democratic states. But again, that once we have public policy taking hold where lockdowns are more likely in Democratic-led states, and there's more kind of encouragement to take vaccines, the places where we see excess deaths are more likely to be Republican states. There are still excess deaths in Democratic states, but the gap is pretty substantial across. So again, there's two ways to think about this, right? Which is that the policies put into place by these states and by the federal government mattered a lot for what the outcomes were. And those varied a lot by the kind of partisanship of the governor. But also what people do at the individual level based on their partisanship really matters for their willingness to do things like vaccinate, and then whether or not they will get sick and maybe have kind of a very bad consequence of COVID. And those are also aligned with people's partisanship. So, I mean, one of the things is that government policy has an effect on who, not specifically who died, but what's the death rates in different places. So if you look at places, this is again from the New York Times, from the COVID States Project, in places where there was higher level of mask wearing because there were mask mandates, the deaths per 100,000 people were significantly lower than compared to places where there were no mask mandates. So this kind of implementation of a thing like a mask mandate mattered because you get more compliance of masking in those places. And that's aligned with the partisanship of the governor. So there's, again, two ways where partisanship and polarization matter, both in which types of governors are willing to implement more kind of mandated vaccines and mandated masks during COVID, and then the individual level willingness to do uptake of these kinds of policies also depends on people's partisanship. So the argument that my co-authors and I make in our book on the pandemic and polarization around the pandemic is that partisanship is the most consistent predictor of differences in U.S. health behaviors and attitudes. And we track this over time from early 2020, March of 2020, over the first year of the pandemic using a series of surveys. Individual level data, we ask people what they're doing during the pandemic, what their health behaviors are, how they think about what the government is doing. What we argue is that partisan politics around COVID-19 made the crisis worse. This partisan response was not inevitable, and that part of this was based on what we argue was deep political polarization that was pre-existing the COVID-19 pandemic. And there was also all sorts of other what we call pre-existing conditions of kind of economic and racial inequality that made the responses in the U.S. worse than other places, our healthcare system that is more fragile than in other places and more unequal. And it was also the case that it was an election year. And so Trump was very interested in re-election and getting the economy back up and rolling very quickly. And that was something that was shared by some Republican governors over Democratic governors. And into all of this political polarization walked coronavirus. And very early on, we see that there is the president downplaying the seriousness of the disease. And the places where the pandemic is hitting first are places that are not key to the re-election of Trump in 2020. So in this kind of noisy environment with low and conflicting information, we might think that individual people in the mass public would want to manage their anxiety by kind of seeking protection. And so people in places where there was more exposure might want more protective policies. They may want to wash their hands more or stay home more because they're more at risk. And that might be the case early on in the pandemic. That's in Democratic states where there's more risk, or among people who they are themselves at higher risk. But what we argue in this book is that what we see is if we saw political leaders who were both Democrats and Republicans uniting over what should be done, then we should have seen the public following along and being more likely to wash their hands, stay home, take a vaccine. But when we saw political leaders divide, then people decided to follow their trusted leader. This is where partisanship means taking the cues from the political leader of your party. Again, my co-authors and I did a series of surveys starting in March 2020 to look at, and I will say that we were not expecting partisanship and polarization to be such a big part of the story, but it was very clear from that first survey on how important people's partisan identities were to deciding whether or not people themselves were going to do things like wash their hands. When we asked them in our first survey, which was a representative survey of 3,000 people, are you doing things to protect yourselves from coronavirus, including visiting the doctor or washing your hands? This is the percentage of people who are doing those things in March of 2020. So there's variation, right? 80% of people said they were washing their hands more. Not very many people are visiting the doctor. But if you look at this is by people's own partisan identities in March of 2020, at the very beginning of the pandemic. Those very light bars at the top are Republicans, Democrats are in the middle, and independents and others are at the bottom. Very early on, Democrats are more likely to be saying that they're seeking info on COVID-19, they're avoiding gatherings, they're washing their hands more. I will say Republicans are doing those things more, but there's a gap between Republicans and Democrats that starts in March of 2020 and doesn't really go away. And so we might think that over time, as COVID then goes from blue to red states, urban to rural, that we might see more compliance with COVID recommendations like washing hands and more of a convergence in the behaviors between Republicans and Democrats. Might be the case that, again, Democrats are just in places that are more likely to be at risk and therefore themselves are at risk. But if it is the case that people are just following or mostly following what their political leaders are saying, unless there's a convergence on what Trump and Biden were saying at the time, we shouldn't necessarily see differences in their in people's health behaviors converge, we should continue to see polarized behavior. And that's essentially what we see. Again, I'm going to just walk you through this briefly. This is those same questions about whether or not you're washing your hands more. Republicans are the diamonds, Democrats are the squares. And this is the same questions over 6 waves of the same survey asked in the identical way. And again, you don't need to read all of the graphs to see that Democrats who are on the top as of March 2020 saying they're doing these things more, they're always doing these things more, even as of 2021. Democrats are always more likely to say they're doing these health behaviors. Republicans, less so. Independents are always in the middle. So there's this polarization, right, to get back to our theme, in people's health behaviors over COVID-19 that are coming from both what their governors are doing, but also what the national environment is saying. And Biden and Trump are giving very different views, and as our members of Congress, about whether or not COVID itself is a risk and how you should protect yourself. So to get to like this first slide that I started to talk to you about kind of COVID deaths are partisan and polarization, the question of how did we get to deaths themselves being partisan, I think comes from our earlier lessons on polarization, which is polarization is not just about differences in ideas about how we govern. I do think there's part of that that's happening. It also comes from differences in identities across the parties. Thinking I am a Republican and I'm going to maintain my identity by kind of doing the things that the political leadership of my party suggested, which is to be okay, maybe not take a vaccine or decide for myself, as opposed to Democrats who, you know, both are much more worried over time and then have political leadership who is advocating for them to stay home and get masked. That polarization at the elite level is leading to polarization at the mass level that is leading to some relatively dire consequences for public health. I don't want to leave you with that kind of dire message, but I think this is the message here, which is the consequences of polarization are to make governance harder, to lower trust and make cooperation harder. But partisanship itself on its own is not a problem. It is an important piece of how people understand political life, how they see themselves, and how they relate to political parties. It's extremely useful, but in its extreme can have consequences both for democratic health and public health that are bad. And so we should think about different places where we could see cooperation, where we could increase trust, and where polarization is just in the background and isn't leading to these kind of democratic erosion problems.